Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Aspen Institute Socrates Program webinar. Our topic today is focused on action and resource allocation from private sector funds to investing in underserved communities. We have three amazing people that will be in conversation today, some faces that you'll know. Firstly, we have Mr. Ben Carson Jr. He is the co-founder and partner at Enterprise Partners. As a middle market private equity firm based right here in Maryland, where he's responsible for the overall strategy of the company and its portfolio. And Enterprise is one of the few minority-owned private equity firms in the country and targets transactions between $3 and $30 million, backing proven executive teams leading highly scalable businesses. It was founded in 2013, and it primarily invests in healthcare, business services, and infrastructure. Prior to joining Enterprise, Mr. Carson served in executive capacity at the Warner Companies, another middle market financial and consulting firm. And at Warner, he led TWC Capital, which advised companies on mergers and acquisitions, capital restructuring, capital raises, investment, risk management, and strategy planning. Henry Childs II is also joining us. He is the founder and CEO of the Minority Wealth Commission. Prior to founding the commission, Childs was the national director for the U.S. Department of Commerce Minority Business Development Agency. And his tenure as the 17th director of that agency, he implemented several key initiatives to help shepherd minority-owned businesses into three mega trends disrupting global business competitiveness, digital transformation, globalization, and demographic change in the United States of America. And finally, joining as a panelist and moderator, we have Ms. Centra Pollack. Centra is an investment and foundation manager in Denver, Colorado. She's run a single-family office called Race Street Management since 2009. She's the secretary and treasurer for the Singer Family Foundation. Before joining Race Street, Centra worked as a research analyst for Granite Point Capital, a long and short equity fund in Boston, Massachusetts. She also worked in the UW Technology Transfer Office, where she was a consultant for the website epilepsy.com, and a browse developer and editor for a new company at that time called Amazon.com. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to enjoy this conversation. Centra, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Cordell. Who knew you were going to get that much information about me? But more importantly than me, I want to start by discussing our panelists' backgrounds. What drove each of you to create the Minority Wealth Commission or Enterprise Partners or the Fulcrum Fund? Henry, let's start with you.
Oh, no. Fantastic. Yeah. So what drove me to start the Minority Wealth Commission? So long story short, I was working at the Department of Commerce, leading the Minority Business Development Agency, and then COVID completely disrupted everything. Saw Black businesses shutting down at unprecedented rates, saw, health conditions disproportionately affecting minorities. So I decided there was more I could do on the outside than the inside. But the strategy that we really wanted to do was we wanted to align all the groups that focused on minority business and minority development. So, there's civil rights groups, your ethnic chambers, and your industry to create a national strategy on how we're going to recover from this crisis and what goals we should be shooting for in the long term.
Amazing. Ben, tell us a little bit about how you started your companies. You're going to have to unmute yourself there.
There we go. Much better.
Perfect.
Yeah. So thank you first of all for having us here today. Enterprise Partners and Fulcrum both have slightly different genesis. Enterprise we started because we saw an opportunity to support minority businesses, and we didn't see a lot of other funds around doing exactly that. There's a lot of minority businesses that have very strong fundamental characteristics, are doing very well, and with a little bit of extra capital, a little bit of additional access to network, and otherwise can be very successful. And we've been, really blessed to be part of that ecosystem, able to support so many minority companies with growing from, a good amount of success to really reaching the level where the larger capital markets, the broader capital markets start to participate in mergers and acquisitions. So we've been very, very lucky to, I think, be one of the few players in that space. And we certainly encourage additional participation in investing in middle market minority businesses. Fulcrum, when Henry first told me he was starting up the commission, I was really excited to see something focused on really building wealth in minority demographics. The racial wealth gap has been an overlooked issue for so long, and thought this was a very interesting take on how to go ahead and solve what I really believe to be the greatest issue of our generation. Fulcrum Funds is the manifestation of part of that outcome of the commission, which one of the goals is to create a series of funds focused on investing in generational wealth creation for minorities. And I'm honored and blessed to be part of that endeavor. Stellar team running the operation, and we're looking forward to being able to support owners and operators in building fantastically durable, sustainable, valuable businesses.
That's amazing. Henry, you already told us a little bit about how your business has changed since COVID, but Ben, why don't you tell us what's happened with you and what you've been doing since COVID? Has it changed?
Sure. First of all, we're living the dream in quarantine, is what we always say. So it's been a lot of fun being at home with the family, of course. We had actually a son born, Benjamin III, in January, so I got to be around for a lot of that. But on the business front, and a lot of things we've been seeing in the market, and I'd really love to hear Henry's perspective on this, because I know he's seeing a lot of interesting trends as well. The transition, I think, to a new economy is what we've been most focused on. We do believe that there's going to be a fundamental shift in how business is conducted. And we've seen a lot of impact to minority businesses, to small businesses, to general business, full and open and otherwise, on multiple facets. One of the very interesting trends that we're monitoring is the work from home and virtualization of business relationships. And what I've heard across the board from is not only our companies, but others as well, is productivity is staying up. And we're actually able to get a lot more done by interacting via Zoom calls and otherwise. So we see this as a fundamental shift in how things are done. And we're looking forward to exploring opportunities in the new economy as that continues to evolve through and after the Omni crisis.
Do you think that these shifts are going to benefit or detract from your ability to help minority businesses grow?
So I think we're cautiously optimistic on that front. I do, and Henry and I were talking about this actually earlier today. When you look at business, minority or otherwise, what we're really looking at is scale and durability as one of the key drivers of whether or not the company is going to be successful. So unfortunately, going into any type of correction or down market, if you have more risk factors that are going to apply to your business, then you're going to be more vulnerable to the market impact. So smaller businesses are going to be a bit more vulnerable, which typically when you think of minority businesses, you're thinking of small businesses. So we are looking at that as an area of consideration and concern. There's a lot of larger businesses as well, though, and we focus typically on the middle market, which is going to be companies that are 25 million plus, maybe up to about 500 million in terms of revenue. So they have a little more scale. But we are seeing areas of concern across the board. I don't think that those are exclusive to minority companies. I do think that is generally something that we're concerned with. For minorities, I think the other thing that's interesting is access to capital and access to networks. So that's an area where we think firms like ours, where we're able to provide some of that access to capital, access to sophisticated strategies and otherwise, can be really beneficial in navigating some of these challenges.
Henry, what are you seeing with the way that we're all changing the way that we live and work with COVID affecting it? How does it affect minority businesses, or is it just, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so the thing is, we were in this future of work period, probably 2 years earlier than any other minority serving institutions I can even think of. In fact, we were so early about this, I get mocked and laughed at when I'd be talking about the fourth industrial revolution and all these things that you hear, from the World Economic Forum and people in Davos that you don't hear in our communities. We were out ahead of that. But what we've actually seen is what COVID has done is what was supposed to take place over like a 2 to 5 year period happen over 2 months. So the businesses that are growing and actually expanding in the market are the, your large cap companies who underwent their digital transformation years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of small businesses, but especially minority businesses, were either just getting started or they weren't complete with that transformation. So it doesn't matter if you're a minority business or any other business, if you cannot serve your companies digitally right now, you're going to have a hard time operating. So what we want to do is we are focused on helping our businesses, realize that this fourth industrial revolution is real. And it's all about digital, and what digital used to be a way to differentiate your business. It's not a differentiation anymore. Like it's a standard. If you do not have digital, then you're not going to be able to grow or scale your business. I don't care how much capital you get. I don't care how many markets you think you're penetrating. That's just a fact that the game has changed.
So, in today's world, inequity, specifically in the US, is on display more than ever before. This digital divide that you're sort of talking about and the availability of digital technology to businesses is only going to exacerbate that. So what are the most important things that you both can do right now? I'll start with Ben, but to actually bridge that divide, to do what you're trying to do.
So bridging the digital divide takes a lot of capital, that's for sure. Modernization always does, any kind of business transformation. I do think that it requires capital. And that's really one of the reasons I think, focusing on the racial wealth gap is so important. If you look at most successful demographics in the United States, you did have wealthier individuals of those demographics and, others. And there's typically been a helping hand that can be extended to help more of that demographic be successful. And when you look at the racial wealth gap and apply these dynamics to things like a digitalization, any kind of business transformation, and you don't necessarily in certain demographic communities have that helping hand that can reach back down and help with a lot of the capital needs and otherwise for doing that, I think it's something that is not talked about as much, but something that really does provide certain advantages in certain areas and disadvantages in others. And I do think that it's very important to tackle those sorts of challenges, especially as we get closer to, a brown country. 2045, of course, according to Brookings, is when minority white is going to be the way the U.S. is populated. So I do think it's something very important and something to focus on. And Henry, I'd love to hear your perspective on it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I work with international organizations like the OECD, and they put out great guides on how to get involved in digital transformation, what's out there. They talk about some of the, I would call mature stuff, e-commerce, artificial intelligence, stuff like that. But then they also do some of the emerging stuff like your blockchain, like quantum computing, your extended reality, and stuff like that. But what's necessary, what I would love to see, we see all these tech companies saying they're cutting these checks for minority businesses. Thank you. But what would be really great is if you would let us leverage your technology. Would it be really great if your Facebooks, your Microsofts, your Googles, your Apples would let minority businesses leverage their technology? Because that's what we really need. Ben's 100% right. We need the capital, but until we get that, help us, leverage your platform. You know how powerful it would be if Twitter would let, groups of Black businesses leverage their platform for free? If Microsoft would teach Azure and some of this other stuff for free, or let us leverage their platforms? That is critical. That's something we can do right now while we're waiting on the capital. So if you want to help, please.
That's really interesting too. And the nature of digital makes the incremental cost to those companies for letting you leverage the capital for those businesses. It makes it so much lower than, it's not really hurting their business. Anyway, I don't want to get into an argument with all the tech companies. I used to work for one, so I'm going to move on to another touchy subject. So I'm going to actually ask you guys, some have equated capitalism at its root with racism, but I'm guessing that you wouldn't spend so much of your time trying to build pathways to capital if you thought it was exploitative or perpetuating inequity at its root. So what are the keys, if you have any for us, to not only building access to capital for underserved communities, but actually making it anti-racist?
I'll just jump all over that because
Did I just, okay, go ahead.
you triggered me. So
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
let's just be very clear. Capitalism right now, at least the way it is in America, is flawed. However, what's important is to learn what are the rules of engagement. That's what I always try to find out, because no one's, wants to hear excuses. And yes, there are barriers, but how do you play the capital game and win is number one question. Number one, I think we have to have just like understanding that money in of itself is not evil. I cannot tell you how many groups I speak to, and I start talking about like billions of dollars, and you can literally feel the nervousness in the air, like, oh my God, I can't believe Henry said he wants to be a billionaire philanthropist. Well, one of us has to be, okay? Because at the end of the day, you have two choices if you don't have money. You can ask other people to give you some of their money, and that's the thing that's been our narrative, for the long time. How do we get corporations to pledge more, give more? How do we get some of these VCs to give more, private equity to give more? Or we can start developing some gigantic minority businesses, and we can start getting more minority billionaires who have the natural inclination to invest in it. So the problem isn't capitalism. Capitalism is not racist. The problem is that we need to understand what the rules are, and we want to make sure that those rules don't change, okay? We want to make sure those rules don't change when we start chasing the capital. So those are my number things. Like, I love capitalists. I love money. I need money because my mission is to help the poor. And unless someone tells me another way to do that, right, money's going to come involved at some point. So I'd rather have it because I trust myself to do good with it than start asking somebody else for it.
Fair enough. Ben, do you have a response to this?
So I'm definitely on the same wavelength with Henry in terms of capitalism. It's a positive thing. We're big believers in capitalism. Meritocracy-based systems are always a good thing in our mind. And, capitalism in this country has been a huge driver for the success of the country as a whole, and why we believe America is the #1 country in the world. When you look at then capitalism as it's broken out into the various demographics, there are certain disadvantages, systemic disadvantages that have been applied to certain areas. And that includes everything from redlining to certain entitlement programs and otherwise that get into the whole social engineering conversation and some of the social constructs that have been built that provide advantages and disadvantages in certain situations. I think our mission is really to make sure that we can even the playing field, which is already, I think, becoming flatter. So we've been encouraged by seeing more conversation around these issues, more conversations about equality, and access to capital. So I do believe capital is one of the great equalizers. And we see it, directly when, we go into a room with, let's say, our peers in private equity. I'm typically one of a handful, if not the only minority in the room. We've got to do something about that dynamic. We've made it a mission in our operations to go ahead and provide what we believe is one of the great equalizers to minority businesses, but there's not many of enterprise partners or fulcrum funds or otherwise out there. There's a handful. And then when you look at the performance even of those funds, then you get into the question of why aren't there more? Because typically you've seen that minority funds actually outperform the benchmark. So why is there not more capital being devoted to minority funds and minority initiatives when the performance, the data actually would support that type of activity? So I do believe that capitalism is a good thing. I don't believe capitalism is racist. I do believe there have been, certain things that have happened that are currently, I think, flattened out, and we need to be deliberate and I think intentional about how we go ahead and move forward from here. But I do believe that it is flattening, and we are honored to be part of the solution.
Okay, so I'm not really trying to argue whether capitalism is good or bad, and I'm sorry if I phrased that in a way that triggered you, Henry. I didn't mean it in that way quite, but I guess what I'm curious about, and one of the things that concerns me when we're looking at investing in minority businesses, in equaling the playing field and creating equity, how do we create better alignment between the funders and the entrepreneurs and the businesses? How do we make sure that everybody is winning at a reasonable rate, and that the cost of capital to these businesses and these entrepreneurs is not a different cost than it would be for somebody else.
Yep. So I'll jump in here because I have this argument with the banks all the time. I was just talking to one of them about why aren't they lending more to minority communities? And the answer from the credit officer was, well, we don't want to take on that additional risk. And I told him, because he's looking to do more for minority communities, I was like, don't ever say that again, because there is no additional risk just because someone's skin color is different, because they're whatever gender or otherwise. That's not a risk factor in and of itself. And we've got to get away from that line of thinking. That risk conversation is what creates the higher cost of capital for minority businesses. And it's not right, it's not fair, but it is something that is systemic. And we do have, I think, an obligation to go ahead and combat that. And I think, if you look at Kaiser Permanente had a great perspective on the socioeconomic determinants of health. Bernard Tyson used to talk about it all the time. We certainly agree with a lot of that, where they were talking about from a healthcare perspective, which, I think aligns very closely with what we're talking about relative to opportunity and capital as well. There's certain things that need to be in place in order to have the best outcome. Not every outcome is driven just by the clinical side. There's a lot of other factors in your environment that actually lead to that outcome. And when you look at the business sense and capital access and whether you're going to be really successful and be that next billionaire philanthropist or not, there's other socioeconomic determinants to how successful you're going to be in pursuing that path. And I think we should be mindful of those as well. Those include education, they include access to healthcare, nutrition, is a huge one as you're looking at developing minds and whether they're going to have everything they need to fully develop to their full potential. There's a lot of factors that play in from the second you're born that determine whether you're going to be more or less successful. And I think we need to tackle those in addition to some of the systemic issues as we're looking at solving these issues.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I think there also has to be, and I'm gonna stay on this line the whole time, so just get ready. It's mindset, because the premise of the question, and it's a great question, is how do we get other people's money? And that's the way I'm going to phrase it. To me, we're never going to do. We've been here hundreds of years talking about, how to make people do the right thing, how to stop people from being racist, how to make people aware of our issues. I'm just assuming it's not going to happen. So your second choice is, how do you build it from within? And it's a more of a radical and it's more of a revolutionary model, but eventually the more minorities we have with wealth, the easier it is for her to have the conversation, how do we get that money into the community and finance the minority economy? So the goal has to be on getting money into the hands of people who have a natural inclination to do this. That way you're not always pitching. And I don't want to pick on, the PPP stuff, but we know what's going to happen if we leave the government to try to do this right. We know if we leave it to your traditional private equity people, what they're going to do, right? So the question is, how do we build it from within? And there's wealth in minority hands. There just is. So how do we align it? How do we coordinate it? And what kind of world do we want to build where it's more, resilient, more equitable, more responsive to the needs of our most vulnerable people? So the answer to your question is, we need to look within first, because we've been looking without for hundreds of years, and it's not going to happen. At least not as fast as I want it to. Okay,
so after you've looked within, how do you then transform that and make it generational wealth, as you mentioned, Ben, and multi-generational wealth, and the kinds of things that really build legacies and opportunity and the availability of the options to take, chances on things? How does it become not only wealth right here and now, but something that is enduring?
Yeah, so one thing I think that is always part of that conversation is perspective. I think this generation, my generation, Henry's generation, et cetera, it's really the first generation where, as a Black person, we've had all our rights. We've had access to a lot of things There's members of us who've grown up with pretty much every advantage that you could have in life. And it's really, I think, a very interesting generation because of that. Where people are having different conversations than have been had historically, because there's different perspectives. When you look at, I think, someone coming from a background where they had, let's say, a two-parent household, where they had access to things that wealthy people have access to. Maybe they had two homes, a beach home and a regular home to go vacation over there. Maybe they knew a couple people who were multimillionaires or billionaires. Maybe they knew the executives at a firm where they got to see a Class A office space and all of the nice cars and things. They just have a different expectation out of life than someone who grew up with none of that. If you grow up not even knowing a single millionaire, how are you even supposed to form the opinion that you should be one, let alone have generational wealth? And when you look at generational wealth, and I'd love, Henry to be able to talk about the definition of that as he sees it as well. I mean, we typically think of it as something that has a floor. If you don't hit a certain marker, then you really don't have generational wealth. You might do fine for your life, but you're not gonna have anything really of means to pass on to the next generation. And it's something that I think if we can change the mindset, if you actually expose kids at a young age, if you expose communities to what's possible, then you start to change that perspective, the mentality, especially ownership mentality, self-responsibility, self-reliance, being able to work within your community and be inclusive to really build value and create wealth in a sustainable manner.
Yep, and just be clear, this isn't one of those pull yourself up by your bootstrap lectures. I'm not going to give you that lecture. We're actually saying out there, we're saying this is the whole purpose of the Minority Wealth Commission. So to answer your question, how do you do it? You have to be very strategic about what you invest in. I think that the playbook is out there. It all starts early education, schooling, how do you get access to, good jobs, affordable college? And then when you get in the workforce, how do you increase your income or become entrepreneurial, right? And then invest back, keep your money in the community. So we know how to do that. And we have some of the smartest organizations, some of the most talented people in the world working with the Minority Wealth Commission. It all has to start in what do you prioritize? And we're really prioritizing things at the macro level. And the three things that we're looking at are investment, what we're talking about now, but it's also innovation and infrastructure. Innovation is critical. Like we keep telling people to start these new businesses, but we don't address what type of businesses you should be starting, right? And I don't mean to knock anybody or be derogatory, but we don't need more, barber shops and stuff like that. We need minority tech businesses. We need global, scalable minority companies. And we need to build ecosystems and clusters where people can get into these industries and grow. And another thing is we need infrastructure. I mean, we've been promised this infrastructure package, for the last 2 years. Don't know where it is, but I know it's coming soon. But the infrastructure has to be building back better. Now's the time to be building smart infrastructure, because our cities, and it's where most minorities live, we can transform those into smart cities. And that's really where you can start having jobs programs. That's when you start, having cleaner air. That's where you start having more efficient businesses. And that's kind of what our younger generation is ready into. We can use this whole, revival, reset, whatever you want to call it, to really rebuild our cities and help our people. So those are the three things I would invest in.
Sintra, one thing I'd love to just mention, and this is, I think, core to that issue of generational wealth. On the Fulcrum Fund that we recently launched, the core metric that we actually track to is called new net worth. And the goal of the fund is to create that generational wealth for the owners that we're investing in. New net worth, our core metric, which we think aligns the impact and the alpha, is from the time we invest to the time that we exit. We want to create no less than 10 million of new net worth on the personal balance sheets of the owners that we're backing. And we set that floor at 10 million because we really believe that without 10 million, let's say that is the floor, you may do well for your lifetime, but can you live for 20 years on whatever amount of money you have? At 10 million, we think that that's a sustainable level of wealth where you'll be able to not only exist during your lifetime comfortably, you'll be able to give back comfortably, you'll be able to pass on comfortably. But then we go one step further beyond just creating that wealth to how do you then be responsibly wealthy, which is the responsibilities of wealth, the stewardship of wealth, and then also the hazards of wealth. How do we avoid those as we're creating new wealth in these communities? So that core metric of new net worth, we think, if we are able to create that for these owner operators, not only do we have that impact of creating now these new generationally wealthy minorities, but we also align with the alpha. So if we're able to do that for the owners, operators, our shareholders will do well, and it's a sustainably altruistic model. Where if we go ahead and create this wealth, we go ahead and generate the returns, we should be able to do successive funds. And hopefully we see more funds like this actually crop up where you can really align the impact and the alpha. They don't have to be a balance. We think there can be a true alignment and go ahead and create a scenario and a platform for doing well and doing good at the same time.
Okay, thanks. You guys are pretty optimistic about the value of generational wealth once you've actually figured out how to create it. And it sounds like you've got some wonderful ideas. And now we're in a really tough time though. And we've got a public health crisis, economic hardship, you've got society sort of pulled to its, most top places, and all of our threadbare places are exposed. And so I guess you both sound kind of optimistic. What makes you so optimistic? How do you see us not only making it through our current struggles and actually emerging better for the long haul?
So let me just say this. One of the best things, and I'm being 100% serious about this, one of the best things for me about being a Black man in America is I can get through just about anything. And I'm not, there is zero fear in me, and I'm not even joking. And it took me a while, but and again, it's going to go back to mindset, because you have two choices, okay? You can either think everything is going down, no matter what you do, you'll never get a loan because the banks, are racist against you. You'll never find a good job. Your kids will never go to a good school, whatever. You can go down that track. And I've been down that track. Or you can look for opportunities and find out a way to really impact change at a big scale. And I'm going to go north, because the one thing that we know is that the post-millennials are the youngest, largest generation in the history of the United States, okay? One of the big things that we haven't talked about is that US demographic change is coming faster than anybody realizes, okay? Right now, the minority population is about 39%. By the year 2033, that's next decade, okay, minority workers in their prime will outnumber their white counterparts, okay? By 2033, okay, right now, post-millennials have ushered in a minority economy. So we know the transition is going to this already. The only question is, how do you generate and cultivate this minority economy? I'm optimistic because the ingredients already there. The ingredients, we have the workforce, we have the money, we have the land that's so high valued. But the question is, how do you turn those ingredients into a recipe of success? And that's what we're doing with the Minority Wealth Commission. We're taking everybody's toolkit. We got all these experts, but they've been working in silos. We're opening up those silos, cultivating up a plan, and that's how we're going to get it done. And I'm optimistic because I don't know how to fail, especially at stuff like this.
Ben.
So first of all, I love that with the ingredients into the recipe. That's I'm gonna use that. So I'm optimistic because at the end of the day, there is a pool of assets and capital and everything else. And if you watch the moves that are being made by those who are informed, there's a lot of money moving around, a lot of repositioning right now as people position for the upside that comes out of really any situation. We're just, in my mind, there's risk, and we temper our optimism with risk management. So we do want to make sure that we're more pulling away the things where we see outsized area of risk, look for areas where there is opportunity and make sure that we're then positioned right for capturing that opportunity. And I think that's regardless of market cycle, you've got to have that perspective. We'd be probably terrible investors. We've got a pretty good track record if, we always took the downside view. As an investor, you kind of have to have some view of optimism in order to even have a path forward. So in this case, when we look at all of these really scary, I'd say, manifestations of the coronavirus that's now affecting the economy, that's affecting all these other areas, it is frightening to think about all the worst case scenarios. But we do see, some areas where there will be movement. And at the end of the day, we don't want to be the first mover in any area. We want to be probably in the first dozen, though, that are coming through. We want to position. We want someone else to trailblaze. We want to walk down that trail as one of the first folks to go down it. But that's where we find our opportunity. And I do believe that as we look at this changing economy, there's going to be a lot of those to uncover. We're already seeing transitions in healthcare, for instance, when the government decided to make telemedicine reimbursable. That's huge. That'll, we think, transform healthcare from being treatment oriented to being more population health management oriented. And that will change a lot of different things across the healthcare landscape. When we see things like the telehealth dynamic, when we see infrastructure, telecom, particularly as we're all on some sort of connection right now, what are our broadband utilization needs? What's happening with 5G? There's a ton of things changing that allow for, if you're well positioned, if you have capital, if you have access, that you can actually go ahead and capitalize on. And if you do that responsibly with a goal of also being mindful of, I think, the impact side. So not only can you make money, you can also improve, I think, the fabric of this country. And that's really where we're focused. And I do believe that the optimism that we have is also, to Henry's point, because, it's really something that's been built into the mindset of most minorities that have made it far enough to even sit on a call like this, where, there are some systemic disadvantages. And you had to plow through all of those. One of the old adages that we grew up with was you have to be twice as good to get half as far. That, I think, is ingrained in most successful minorities out there. And I believe it's one of the things that keeps us optimistic and keeps us thinking that there are going to be opportunities in the future to really go ahead and have transformative change. And I think this Omni crisis has made a lot of the challenges more acute, has brought them into focus. And now we're seeing the momentum in the capital markets. We're seeing momentum in corporations and otherwise, as we're now having these conversations and really focusing on some of these challenges that, could have been addressed 10 years from now. Now they're all coming into focus today. And I'm really excited to see that happening.
Okay, well, just before we wrap this up, I do want to ask a question that you alluded to earlier, Ben. But, moral considerations aside, social justice aside, all of that aside, investing in underserved communities is really good economic business. So what is the most exciting for you when you look at opportunities? It's not riskier. So what makes you really excited as investors or in trying to find businesses to invest in? What makes them economically superior?
So, it's kind of a double-edged sword on trying to answer that question. Because one of the reasons that we've been able to find such good opportunities in minority business is because no one else is looking there. And if there's no competition in the market, then we're going to be able to buy better. We're going to be the only ones to show up to the dance. And, it's been good for driving returns. We've been able to help a lot of companies. But it's also a negative in the sense that, I wish there were more groups to actually compete with and drive those multiples up, drive the competition up, because that would ultimately help more businesses. But we've always found it to be, a positive in the sense of will drive high returns, but a negative in the sense that if you're a minority business, you've got to basically come to us. There's a couple other groups out there, but there's not a large pool of folks that you can talk to. And if your business doesn't work for us, it doesn't work for a couple others, then you're kind of out of luck. And that's not really a great ecosystem for the businesses. So part of the whole Minority Wealth Commission mantra is to actually get more assets under management to minority operators so that we can change that dynamic. Now for our model and investing in minority businesses, maybe those multiples start to creep up. The average middle market multiple Q1 2020 was 12.2x. Try to apply that to minority businesses. you'll never see it happen. And that's down from 12.7x in 2019. I mean, we're in massive multiples. When we look at businesses in the middle market on the minority front, we're seeing single-digit multiples almost always. We don't ever see them creep up into the doubles. Now, once we reposition them, as we're going through our process, we can get them up to those double-digit multiples. And that's through scale. That's through building out the right, I'll say, operational and tactical things that are needed to really build value in a business, executing on strategic roll-up strategies, et cetera. But it's not there today. And that's it's a good thing for, I'd say, us investing there. But we'd like to see that change.
Henry, any thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
No, I think what I just mentioned before, all you have to do is look at demographics. I'm a numbers guy, and I just eat numbers every single day. If you just look at the population growth trajectory of this company, if we just close a racial wealth gap, and that's what we're committed to, and that's what we're going to do. If you just close the racial wealth gap by the year 2050, it's an $8 trillion gain to United States GDP. Okay, so don't do it because it's the right thing to do. Do it because, as you mentioned, the metrics are there. The numbers show that these businesses actually get the returns. They outperform their counterparts, but also because these are the businesses that are growing in America. I mean, minority businesses, just a number of them, that's where all the growth is coming from, right? I mean, if you look at the last census data, minority businesses were growing like 7 to 10 times faster than non-minority. So it's not a matter of just do it because you feel good one day. Like, this is where future growth comes from. And business people, especially investors, always talk about we're investing in the future, except for when it comes to minorities. So I just want to put that out there.
So if
I can give you one more stat on that. So,
okay.
I mean, this is something that we've been tracking is, if you look at the supplier diversity spend in private sector, government sector is readily available too, but $104 billion was spent by the Fortune 500s on their supplier diversity program just last year. And we're seeing that increase. That is an increasing trend. When you look at the breakup of who got that money, the largest minority businesses, of course, WWT, $12 billion. The top 10 minority businesses took up $20 billion. So 20% of that whole supplier diverse spend went to just the top 10. Then you look at the top 500 minority businesses, and all of a sudden you're at $53 billion of that. So like there's opportunity out there, but the top of the pyramid is currently getting a disproportionate share. We need more large minority businesses to broaden out that pyramid over time. It's got to be flattened by bringing bigger companies to the dance. So all the little ones that are out there, great, keep doing it. We wish you the best of luck, but we also have to be focused on broadening out that spend on the middle and upper layers, such that we really can go to CPOs out there and say, you do have options of sustainable, durable, larger companies that can take on a $50 million, $100 million contract, and you can be confident that we'll be able to deliver. You don't get that with the small businesses, you get that with the larger ones, which is why we see more of the spend pushed to the top. We need to broaden that top funnel. And that's where this generational wealth, where capital access, we're building these larger, more scaled businesses can actually be a very compelling investment opportunity, because on our acquisition of a non-minority business turning into a minority business, all of a sudden we're one of the largest minority businesses in that sector. That's something that all of a sudden is very attractive to the $1 billion round table, to all of the Fortune 500s that are looking for those minority businesses that can take those larger contract opportunities. And we typically see our companies double in the first 2 years following our investment, just from that dynamic.
Amazing. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think we're going to turn it to Cordell so we can ask and answer some of the audience's questions. But this has really been interesting and informative, and I'm now optimistic. I don't know if I came into this conversation optimistic. Now I'm optimistic.
Great. Thank you so much, Centra. I want to pick up on something that Ben was saying in his closing remarks, this idea of existing supply chains. And I have these ongoing conversations about the efficacy of corporate philanthropy when you have a much larger spend that could be innovated. If you innovate the way you're spending, perhaps you would capture the same result and do it in a very efficient way. And I just want to resurface this idea of supplier diversity and this idea that if you were to look at what you're already spending and just bring in some different people, your chief procurement officers and their team would have to work a little differently to go out and find these folks. But perhaps, Ben and Henry, that's your job, to identify these companies that are able to say, hey, I can do that $50 million contract. I can prove that I can execute. Here's my own supply chain.
So I'm gonna disagree, but I'm gonna lay out my.
All right.
So first of all, full disclosure, I consult for the National Minority Supplier Development Council, which does exactly what you're just trying to do.
Okay, fantastic.
For a supplier development company in the world. So I do that. But again, I'm talking about to create generational wealth has to be a shift from mindset. That's still more the old school. How do we get other people to commit more money to Black and brown people and women? What I'm talking about is how do we build minority companies to the size and scale where now we have a Black Facebook, we have a Hispanic Google, we have an Asian Apple, right? How do we get our companies to that scale? Because then it's not, hey, Microsoft, I would love if you increased your spend 5%. That's great, and they should, but that's still not going to create generational wealth. At the end of the day, until we are the owners of these Fortune 50, these Fortune 100 companies, we're going to have the same conversation, and I don't want to have the same conversation my parents had, right? And I don't want our younger generation to have the same conversation we're having. At the end of the day, the question is, how do we get our businesses to size and scale?
So how does it happen? That's the question. I get the what, but how? What are the methods?
Yeah, I think in my mind, I would say yes and yes. So I'd say Henry fully agree, and our goal is to create, with our investments, the next 10 to 20 leading minority businesses in this country. We need both. We need deliberate, I think, and direct action on increasing the dollars available for supplier diversity. But I think on supplier diversity, supplier diversity has to be very deliberate in what they're doing too. I think that also it goes beyond Henry's point, just supplier diversity. We've got to have, a broader goal out there, and the how you get there, I think that's back to the capitalism discussion. We do have to have an ecosystem that is, I think, deliberate and intentional in the way that it's built, and provide the right platforms to really accelerate the growth of these minority businesses. And I think, if we're able to do that, and we're able to collaborate with the current Fortune, whatever level businesses, and we're able to build more of these larger, more sustainable, more durable minority businesses, and we continue to just let the economy evolve on its own, naturally we'll see more minority businesses. But to grow to that scale, you need capital. There's no way that Apple would be Apple if they didn't have outside investment. Same with Microsoft, same with every other company out there that you can think of scale. There's money behind those that looks like the operators of those companies. We need money behind the Black-owned companies, the Asian-owned companies, the Hispanic-owned, et cetera, that looks like those company founders. There need to be networks that work together. And one of the reasons why you see Silicon Valley as such a successful place for venture capital is there's just folks who work together really well and have been doing it for a long time, and they have that advantage. You get into that ring as a venture and backed company in Silicon Valley, you're gonna be more successful than if you get into the ring of the venture backed ring, and name another place in the country. There's a lot of good ones, but Silicon Valley's done something really special in building that ecosystem. And I think the focus is really, how do we create the right ecosystem for these businesses to be successful, and how do we get them to scale so they can really participate in the parts of the capital market that really start to accelerate growth, so that we can make it to that Fortune 50 level, Fortune 10, Fortune 1, one day.
Well, Centra, as a person that's been involved in family offices and foundations for a few years now, I wonder, how are your cohorts in the same field, if you will, reacting to our current moment? Are you all doing something different? Are there these broad commitments that we're seeing from the private sector coming out from family offices? Just wonder if you can expound a bit on that.
Well, I don't know, because the family offices that I choose to associate with are the ones that I talk to, are the people who care about things the way that I care about them. And so I'm not going to argue against you guys to say that capitalism is a good thing. I'm a capitalist, but I also have seen places where capitalism is failing a lot of people. And so with the privilege and the influence that I have, I've been trying to find ways to grow businesses, but also think about how to fix the aspects of capitalism that have exacerbated these divides. And it's not easy work, and there is some risk to it. And so the people that I talk to are really interested in that. And I don't know that we're successful yet, but we have ideas and we have hopes. And I think that the world is shifting a little bit into the way that we look at what ideal capitalism is. And there are different ways of looking at what a successful form of capitalism would look like. And I don't know what that evolution is going to be exactly, but I feel like it will be one that takes more into account stakeholders, more into account communities, more into account environmental impact, and that it's not always profit maximization.
So yeah,
Henry, you were going to say something? Go ahead, Henry.
I wanted to totally jump in because I hope I was clear in the beginning. If capitalism worked for everybody, trust me, I would not have started the Minority Wealth Commission. Please understand that.
No, I
Very clear. The assumption is it's actually broken. But what I'm saying is, what capitalism is supposed to do, when you talk about achieving the American dream, when you talk about having a better life for yourself, for your family, for your community, I've not found anything better than capitalism. Yes, we need to move towards a true definition. Like back in the day, companies, and this is gonna seem odd coming from me because I don't actually talk about physical companies. I always talk about virtual. But companies were a mainstay in the community, right? So you'd have like a GM, build a huge plant, hire a whole bunch of people in the community, and you would see it kind of stabilize that community. But what we're seeing now with this whole tech thing is a tech company can literally work somewhere in Silicon Valley, hire about 10 people, disrupt those old businesses, right? So you take down your Polaroid, you take down your Blockbusters, you take down all these companies actually hiring and have physical plants, and there's been no answer to that. So when I say, so yes, we need to move toward the true sense of capitalism where companies actually, have a cost in the community, right? Where they actually benefit the people living there. And it's not just all about maximizing shareholder value. And I think we're moving towards that, but I'm talking about right now with the rules as they exist, we got to go get to the money.
Well, ultimately, I would argue that shareholder value will only be maximized if the company is sustainable, and not just sustainable environmentally, but socially sustainable. And so we have a long way to go, but I'm hoping that we will get to that different definition of maximizing.
There was a study by CVM 2019 that came out where they were asking corporations about their perspective relative to really it was the majority minority Hispanic population that now has over $1 trillion of buying power. And what they found is that on the consumer side, about 47% of consumer buying decisions relate to their view of the brand on the minority side, their view of the brand and how they're approaching the minorities and the issues that are prevalent in those communities. So the corporations, knowing that almost 50% of buy decisions can be impacted by whether or not they're actually participating in supply diversity program, inclusion, et cetera. That's a powerful motivator where I think we'll see more KPIs on the corporate level, to your point on sustainability in this space. I think we'll see more KPIs on the CPO side, on the inclusion side internally, that are focused on minority issues because the consumers are now able to speak with their wallets and they want to see more of a focus on minority issues.
I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Judy Samuelson from the Business and Society program at Aspen. She's based in New York. For more than 40 years, she's been working with companies and their leaders to try to think differently about what increasing shareholder value means. And just last year, I want to say last fall, yeah, no, maybe last summer, actually, last August, the Business Roundtable, which is a association of the top 250 CEOs, Fortune 250, came out with a new statement that the job of the corporation, the mission of the corporation is not just shareholder value, but also to add value to all of its stakeholders, whether they own a share in the company or not. And so even before COVID, we were trying to imagine a less destructive form of capitalism that Henry alluded to, this idea that you come in and just you take over a certain category and you wipe everyone out and we move on to the next thing. And so I just wonder, Sintra, especially in your travels where you're actually talking with some light-minded folks, what are some examples that give you hope of this new capitalism that the Omidyar Network talks about, this capitalism reimagined is believe what they call it. Just are you seeing any things that are just rays of light to you?
Well, a tough question to answer just off the top of my head. I will say that whenever anybody is, well, I would say the rise of B Corps. I don't know if the rise of B Corps is perfect. I don't know that it's the right solution, but the idea that a bunch of corporations are starting and putting as part of what they want to do, that they're thinking about everything that is involved, their employees, their product, their customers, as well as their impact on the world. I think that that's probably a more holistic and a longer lasting way to grow a business. It's not a great answer, but there's a lot of stuff that gives me hope, but I guess it's that they're all really small examples so far, and I want to see those examples scale. You can do a lot of really great things on an individual basis with one company or one neighborhood or one entrepreneur, but to get that to be the broad way of thinking and to get people to embrace that way of looking at the world is going to take some time and effort. And I'm not sure that I'm optimistic that's going to happen soon, but I'm definitely optimistic that people care about it and that we're going that direction.
My dear colleague, Jay Cohen Gilbert, created B Corp as part of his Henry Crown Fellowship experience, and to watch the impact that has had on the world has been tremendous. Same question to Ben and to Henry as we wrap up. What's giving you hope? You all are building a $250 million fund. What are you excited about besides fundraising?
No one's excited about fundraising, right?
Personally, I love it. I mean, one of the things that we've seen on the fundraising trail has been excitement. We had a conversation yesterday with one of the group. They look at a lot of different funds. They typically don't do first-time funds, which, you know, this in its current capacity would be considered a first-time fund. You know, they were excited about what we were doing, and I've never been on a capital raise trail where we've seen this level of engagement and excitement from people just hearing about what we're doing. And that's just powerful. I mean, it's been wonderful to be a part of those conversations. And then we look at the impact. You know, one thing that I'm really excited about is this next 10 to 20 leading minority businesses. You know, if we can prove the model, we can rapidly move to fund 2, 3, 4. And this is nothing different than what we've been doing historically. It's just now we can take in with this new structure, CRA dollars, the Community Reinvestment Act dollars. So we're seeing a lot of interest from banks and from insurance groups and, you know, other groups that typically have community impact related dollars, where instead of putting those into a lending capacity, and I'm sorry to go on the soapbox for a second, but the minority companies, they need equity. They don't need debt. There's debt solutions out there, but we need to get more equity into minority investing world. That has to happen in order for these companies to really grow, to be the Fortune whatever level companies. We cannot build exclusively on debt. We do need debt available. So we do want to have those partnerships with banks, with MDIs, CDFIs, et cetera, but we need to have equity. And what we typically see with equity now in a business, those banks that previously wouldn't have done the deal, those other lending institutions that wouldn't have invested in that operation, they're now comfortable because now there's equity in the business. Now there's an underlying, you know, backer. There's a sponsor with additional capital they can throw in, and that makes the banks look at a company completely differently. So when we look at like what is the impact, I think it's really setting up a platform that can really start to change the narrative around minority businesses. And we've seen it happen with our existing portfolio, with our legacy portfolios. The second you take a business from being a family-owned mom and pop, maybe a $20, $30 million, $50 million business, but with no private equity backing, into now a sponsor-backed, private equity owned or supported business, you see the banks just turn over a different page. It becomes a completely different conversation, and you see the doors that can be opened up. Now they have that network access where you can pick up the phone and call a Cordell and say, "Hey Cordell, what do you think about this idea? How should we be thinking about this creatively?" And you have a new level of, I think, advantage that business previously didn't have. That's what we need to bring more of to market. And I think that's how you really build that ecosystem, build the sustainability, build shareholder value, go ahead and create that generational wealth, is by bringing now these things that have been prevalent in business historically, just not minority businesses, to now the minority populations, and really helping to drive that intentionally and directly through our actions.
Fantastic. Henry, you have the last word.
Yeah, so what gets me excited is, for the first time ever since I've ever been alive, I literally believe that the momentum is on our side. And to answer your question earlier, like if you take BlackRock, they have their ESG goals. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make demographics change right up there with climate change and some of these other goals that companies are committed to. So we're saying, look, we love your portfolio. We love the fact that you have these ESG goals. BlackRock, you're sitting on something like $6 trillion of assets under management. Invest in minority businesses. Invest in infrastructure in cities. So when I hear, and I'm glad, your soft banks, they're committing their money. I saw Bill Ackman's doing something in this space. I say, work with the Minority Wealth Commission. Invest in things like the Fulcrum Fund, things that we know we can get that money to the people who need it the most quicker than anybody, okay? And we have track record in this space. This is not brand new to us. We didn't just wake up one day and say, you know what would be great? What if we did a $250 million fund and we invested in minorities? Like, no. Like, I've been in this space. I've been trying to solve this issue on how do you help people since I could be born. I think I'm a little crazy about it, but this is my life mission. Some people like, jets, I want a jet, but right now I'm interested in helping people, right? So, and we have all these smart people. I'm excited because you have people, like the World Economic Forum working on this space, economists like, Mariana Mazzucato working on these questions, these deep questions that people are finally saying, you know what, we're not going to put up with the status quo anymore. Things have got to change. So that's why I'm pumped.
Well, I'm pumped because of you all. Thank you, Sintra. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Ben. This has been a fantastic conversation. And to the listening audience, thank you for joining us again. Next week, we're back. We'll be here with Bill Powers and Ilwan Rohan from Germany. They will be covering how can we make surveillance work for us, and there's all of this surveillance technologies. Don't miss that conversation. It'll be riveting. Next Thursday, August the 20th from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, you all take care of yourself. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again to my panelists.